Alrighty, I think it's a good time to get started. So officially, welcome. I hope you all are doing well and having a wonderful spooky season October. My name is Drew Scammell, and I'm a project manager in the Center for STEM Education and Workforce, or CSU, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. On behalf of our AAAS IUSE initiative, I'd like to welcome you to today's AAAS IUSE virtual workshop and our last of 2025. Embracing and implementing innovative teaching concepts. Today's workshop will feature presentations from Dr. Kaitlyn Casimo, Dr. Stephen Neshyba, and Dr. Tessa Andrews. And before we jump into the workshop, I have just a few housekeeping notes I'd like to go over. Let's get my slides advanced. Perfect. This presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be made available in the coming weeks on our website at AAAS-iuse.org. You'll also receive an email with a link to the archive when it's available. And please note, we'll be transitioning to Q&A discussion breakouts following the presentations. These breakout rooms will allow for deeper engagement and will be speaker specific, and those will not be recorded. Additionally, via Zoom, we have closed captioning for this workshop. You can download and view the full transcript by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who are new to the AAAS IUSE initiative, this program seeks to support faculty, students, and the greater undergraduate STEM education community by disseminating research and knowledge about STEM teaching, learning, and institutional transformation. We invite you to learn more about the AAAS IUSE initiative on our website and hope you'll join our community as future contributors, which I'll mention a little bit more at the end as we are coming up on a new season of vlogs and workshops for IU, so there'll be a call for submissions there. You can stay up to date on our latest efforts by joining our mailing list through our website or following CSU on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. And with that, we will shift over to our first presentation of the day. I would like to welcome Dr. Kaitlyn Casimo, Education and Engagement Manager at the Allen Institute. So Kaitlyn, I will pull down my slides and hand it over to you.
All right, slides look good.
Beautiful.
All right, fabulous. Hi, everybody. I am Kaitlyn. It's nice to meet you all. This is a big talk title, but I am basically going to be focusing on approaches to incorporating open science into teaching, what we have learned about how it impacts students' knowledge and attitudes, and some of the pitfalls that we've discovered to incorporating open science into the classroom and some of the ways to mitigate them. And this is my very first time presenting on this project, so I am so excited to show you what we have done. So first, come on, computer. You can do it. There we go. What is open science? The Allen Institute, where I work, is a biomedical sciences research nonprofit that practices open science across its scientific research. So what does that mean? So first of all, open scientific knowledge, the actual open science material that can include data as well as software, like experimental protocols, hardware schematics, and so much more. Open science infrastructure, which is shared infrastructure, so not just something that necessarily one group is using, that enables all of the above to be created and then also to be shared and reused. And then two other elements besides the research practices. First is engaging with societal actors. So that can include crowdfunding, so bringing in like support for research that is informed by what the community wants, as well as engaging the community in the research directly through something like citizen or community science. And then dialogue with other knowledge systems. So other ways of knowing besides what we have done in any given project. So open science is a growing movement in research, and there is a strong potential role for incorporating it into education, both for the benefits that it directly provides in the educational context, which is what I'm going to be focusing on here, and also because it prepares students to engage with open science when they become professionals themselves. And of course, there are benefits to students understanding open science practices and values, even if they don't elect to become professional scientists themselves. Some of the strengths include increasing the quantity of data and the types of data that are available to students that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access in an educational setting. Things like human tissue and different types of advanced and expensive microscopes. It enables students to work with large quantities of authentic data in lecture-only classes or in conjunction with material that they collect themselves in their laboratory settings. And it especially enables student research projects from a cure, or even just a 1 week-long unit, which is what we did in this project, all the way up to entire thesis projects. And actually, I know of a few whole dissertations for PhD students that use just Allen Institute data and never set foot in a lab themselves. But the broader point is that it enables hands-on, authentic, inquiry-based learning by reducing barriers to entry to getting the data that students need in order to be able to do things, even if those barriers are not removed entirely. There are still technical challenges related to the uptake of open science resources. Some of these resources are quite difficult to get started with. It doesn't teach the students wet lab skills. And it teaches different skills about generating a research question and figuring out hypotheses than it does if you've collected the data yourself. And the potential research questions are not infinite. It does require computational skills and it does require computers, which is a lower barrier than a wet lab, but it's not none. And frankly, some of these open science resources are not super user-friendly, especially for students. So it has a ton of potential benefits and a ton of benefits beyond the confines of the classroom, but it does not a panacea. So in our project, we asked a handful of research questions. About the effect of learning with open science. So we created 2 different lesson variants that use open science resources to learn scientific concepts related to mitosis and cell structures. One of them uses qualitative methods only, and the other one requires more advanced quantitative methods. And we were interested in how these 2 different types and depths of interaction with open science influence students. Do they need to do a full-on experiment, or do they benefit from just exploration? Do they derive greater feelings of ownership over their project and feeling of science identity from this more advanced project that uses a quantitative skill set, or do they become overwhelmed and feel put off? And we're also interested in the impact on their actual knowledge of the core concepts in the lesson, which include mitosis, which is one of the key concepts covered in the units, but far from the only one. We were also interested in the faculty's own attitudes and perceptions of their students' attitudes. We were interested in their expert opinion and their firsthand experience of teaching these units that we designed for them and that they implemented in their class, as well as their observations of what the students' experiences were. So again, we have 2 tracks of these lessons. We recruited faculty and then randomly assigned them to one of these 2 tracks, balancing for 2 and 4-year institutions. And then they taught a 4-lesson unit that we designed and that they implemented in a standardized fashion with their class. Track A was the qualitative version. Here are some of the learning goals. This is a subset of them. And then track B was the quantitative version. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a minute about the tools that the students used in these units. And then in both cases, at the end of the unit, they filled out surveys. The students told us about their science identity, their self-efficacy. They uploaded their completed assignments so we could look at the actual work that they did. And then the faculty also responded to some additional questions, both of their observations of their students and their own feelings towards the unit and towards open science. And we are just about to release these units for anyone to use in their teaching now that our data collection on this phase of the project is complete. They're super modular. They can be easily separated and adapted. So in the context of this study, they were taught as 4 lesson sequences, but you can pull out individual segments of them and use them separately. And that they are straightforward to make more challenging for advanced students as well. So they can easily be adapted. And these were designed for first-year college students, intro freshman level. All right, so the qualitative track used several tools to facilitate students exploring fluorescently labeled 3D images of human cells. So the first one here is the integrated mitotic stem cell. These are all available if you go to allencell.org, ALLEN, like a wrench. The integrated mitotic stem cell walks students through the fluorescent labeling process. So these are human-induced pluripotent stem cells that have been fluorescently labeled to highlight 1 or sometimes 2 specific cell structures at a time. It talks them through that editing process and how to interpret the data in a digital essay, like a scrollytelling, like they do on the New York Times website. And then it gives them the opportunity to explore the data themselves. It also features expert curated selections of these cells in different phases of mitosis and that have different cell structures labeled, some of which are ones that students often don't think about in the context of mitosis, like the endoplasmic reticulum is not one that gets a ton of attention. The visual guide to human cells is thus the middle one here, uses composite illustrations that are derived from real data to illustrate the relative locations of different cell structures, how they interact with each other, and you can also step that cell through the different stages of mitosis. It is the only data tool the Allen Institute offers that is specifically designed for students. Everything else the Institute offers is designed for professional scientists, and we are adapting it for use with students. And finally, on the right, the deep cell zoom doesn't offer any analysis functionality. It just makes it easy to explore a very large quantity of fluorescently labeled cells very quickly. Now we have our quantitative unit. The students use a couple of resources that have related functionality that show the same types of data as the quantitative resources or qualitative resources. The Cell Feature Explorer includes pre-computed quantitative features of cells, such as cell volume and DNA volume, which is used as a proxy for nuclear volume, as well as expert-generated labels of what phase of mitosis each cell is in. Students can explore them on this graph, which they can then change out what is on the axes, and actually stage of mitosis is one of those options. And they can also look at individual images of the cells in a built-in 3D cell viewer. So you can see I've got a cell highlighted in this screenshot. They can then click in and look at that cell in more detail and rotate it on a little digital turntable and look at its properties more close up. And then we also have the students use the quantitative cell feature data on its own in a CSV format, which we have curated for this particular lesson sequence. The data isn't selected to show a particular experimental result. It's just a subset of the total data set, which contains hundreds of thousands of cells and is kind of unwieldy to manage. And we have some walkthroughs for students on how to plot this data in either Excel or Google Sheets, knowing that different campuses have different software at their disposal. Across all of these tools and resources, students did run into some technical challenges, and some of these were related to limitations of the tools themselves. For example, the Cell Feature Explorer doesn't work very well on touchscreens, and some of them were due to students' inexperience with this specific software or with dealing with real scientific images rather than illustrations or other just general introductory level getting to know how to do this kind of science. We were specifically targeting intro level students so that they were specifically pretty inexperienced, but overall they found it mostly pretty straightforward to use, and they were able to dive in, explore this data with a minimum of prep time. All right, so now getting into these survey results. First, we asked students to define, what is open science? What do you think it is? The two conditions, the quantitative and qualitative, are actually combined here because the differences in frequency of how often students mentioned these themes in their responses was pretty minimal. Uh, in the quantitative condition, students were more likely to mention the availability of data in that it involves data in some way in their response. That is the only difference between the conditions. So number one was students mentioning that open sciences makes data and resources available to others. So an example student quote here, that it's free and open for anyone to use. And 2/3 of students mentioned something to that effect. Half of students mentioned something about data. This often overlaps with the theme of availability, which is actually present in this sample student quote. And again, this is the only one where there was difference between the conditions. The next most common was the idea of sharing, that open science involves sharing in some way. And the fourth most common theme was broadening participation, a comment that explicitly mentioned something about how open science can reduce barriers or increase equity in science in some way. It is not one of the four most common themes, but I did also want to call out that we had about 5% of the responses, which was a roughly equal percentage between the two conditions, where the students' response demonstrated some kind of misconception about what open science is, such as our sample quote here, science in which you learn everything. 5% for a really relatively brief intervention of only 4 lessons is, I think, pretty good. And those students still overall had a pretty positive impression of open science, even if they were incorrect about the definition. We also asked students to rate how they felt they understood open science, both now at the end of the unit and looking back to before the unit. This retrospective pre-post design helps reduce known effects where people overestimate their skills before they're put to the test, and also eliminated the significant problem of losing data if we were not able to get survey responses from students at both time points from before the unit and after the unit. And this was particularly important because we were not the ones teaching the unit. We recruited 32 instructors from across the United States who taught this with their classes. So overall, the students rated that they understand open science better now after participating in this unit than they did before, which is great. Many of these students had little to no exposure to open science before the unit, so it's not a huge surprise that they feel like they understand it better now, but it's still good to see. And open science is also a very broad concept, so it's not super surprising to see that their ratings here are topping out at about 5 after the unit, because they recognize that they still have a lot to learn. We also asked them, if you produced scientific resources, would you share them openly? And the students felt even more positively about this. It's good to see that they feel positively about engaging this, and our intervention does seem to have increased that positive feeling. All right, so next up, we asked students to think about their experience using the open science resources in our unit. How did they feel? And we specifically asked them to include both positive and negative responses. The two categories are combined here to show the most common themes. Most of these most common themes were equally likely to be mentioned by both conditions. So the number one is that they said that it improved their understanding, helped them learn better or better understand a concept, which is great. That they feel like this didn't just have wasn't just fun, it wasn't just something that they did as an activity, but that it actually helped them understand the science better. We did specifically ask for negative comments, so it is not terribly surprising that almost 1 in 5 students had trouble navigating the website. It is a challenging set of functions to do, so that if challenge navigating the website was the most common negative response, I think that is something that we can mitigate as educators. Students also mentioned, again, the idea of accessibility or availability of data, that they were able to get in there and interact with real data. Number 4 was that they said it was fun, which I think is really nice and positive, that they were having a really good experience here. And then others work, that something about noting that it was allowing them to use resources that were created by other people. The quantitative condition was more likely to mention the idea of it being others' work. Yeah, all right. We also asked students to rate their skills on a scale of 1 to 7 for these 5 core scientific thinking skills. And again, using the retrospective pre-post design to rate their skills before the unit. We did see a small but statistically significant growth of before versus after across all 5 of these skills. And for these 3 that are marked with the bar, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, and engaging in argument from evidence, there was a significant difference between the 2 conditions, where the qualitative condition, the green, self-rated the difference as being greater. They self-rated as experiencing greater growth than the students in condition B. We also asked the faculty to rate this for their students, and that they also agreed that there was a significant increase across all 5 of these skills across both conditions. But the faculty noted greater growth in the quantitative condition for the math skill, math and computational thinking, but not the other 4. So a different one than what the students rated for themselves as experiencing greater growth. We also use this single item STEM identity measure of Venn diagrams, asking students to select the Venn diagram of themselves and STEM professionals that most represents their view of themselves. Again, a small but statistically meaningful increase in STEM identity in each of the 2 groups from before to after, but there was no difference between the 2 groups in this rating. And it's not terribly surprising that these ratings are quite low. They are first year students, and many of them probably won't even go on to be science majors. And even I would only rate myself a 6 out of 7 on this scale. So the relatively low ratings on here is not a huge surprise. Finally, we asked students to rate their self-efficacy, their confidence in themselves. Do they believe in their ability to work with open science? For all of these questions, for both groups, there was an increase over time, but there was no difference between the groups. This is the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire. This is one of the subscales from that questionnaire. So we also analyzed it as a complete subscale as a group, and which is how it was validated in the original survey. And there was also no difference between the two groups, but there was a significant increase from before to after in both groups when it's analyzed as a subscale. We also administered the TOSR-I subscale, which also gets at this self-efficacy idea. And there were a handful of items in that one that there showed no impact over time, but the scale as a whole showed growth from before to after and no difference between the two groups. Finally, we asked the faculty a variety of attitudes, and we are still analyzing their qualitative responses on the free response questions, but briefly, I wanted to touch on their survey responses for the open science questions, and the faculty ratings on these were comparable to the students' self-ratings, very similar levels that they believe that the students understand what open science is better, and that they believe the students are more likely to share scientific resources openly as a result of participating in this unit. Oh my gosh, I'm running out of time. So some quick takeaways from creating these lesson units. The students required some pretty significant technical scaffolding, like screen cap walkthroughs to help them with specific steps, but that we were able to do both quantitative and qualitative activities using the same types of data, and the students were able to figure it out. There were some trade-offs between the two different types of assignments, between the level of detail that the students could accomplish and the functionality that they could use in the more technical quantitative assignments versus the relatively easier to use qualitative tools. But students overall reported that they perceived these exercises helped their understanding and they had a good time. Students had positive attitudes towards open science and modest but statistically meaningful improvements in their self-efficacy and science identity. This is such a short intervention, it's only a week, that is fantastic. And there were very few differences in the student attitude measures between the two lesson conditions, which means that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what faculty could implement and still get these positive outcomes. And that the faculty's observations were concurrent with what the students observed as well. The last thing I want to talk about in my last little bit here is that we are developing a concept inventory of mitosis that we used on these students in order to measure their knowledge of the scientific concepts that we were teaching using open science. Here's a couple of the questions from the concept inventory. I'll leave these up for a moment. So these are multiple choice questions where students are asked to select all of the correct answers for each question. And here are the some of the correct answers here. On the left question, these two questions that are marked in green are correct answers, and they also had very strong discrimination index, meaning that the students who performed best on the test were more likely to get those questions right. And on the right here, these two bolded questions had good discrimination indices. Question C is incorrect answer. Or sorry, this one is a correct answer and had a poor discrimination index. Everybody got that one right. Um, so we are still testing this, and we are about to do one final round of testing. So we are recruiting faculty and their students for follow-up data collection to be finishing testing our concept inventory and to do a few more survey questions on attitudes towards open science. I will put the link to this in the chat, as well as you can scan the QR code here. I want to thank the study team, which includes our collaborator Carlos at North Carolina State University, as well as Gideon, Claire, and Maddie here at the Allen Institute. Thank you to our project evaluator and our consulting statistician, all of our amazing participants, and thank you to the NSF for supporting this. And I am over time. Thank you.
No worries at all. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. And with that, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Stephen Neshyba, professor at the University of Puget Sound in the Northwest Research Association. So, Stephen, over to you.
I'm gonna get back to the beginning of my talk. So I am Stephen Neshyba. I teach chemistry at the University of Puget Sound here in Tacoma, and everything I'm going to tell you about today is, it part of, much of it came out of really fruitful conversations with many others, including Dr. Penny Rowe, who's going to be joining us today, Tim Filippo, and many students. So, title is using Jupyter Notebooks for in the college STEM classroom. And here's just a question. If we want STEM students to gain skill in calculating numbers, it is appropriate to teach them how to do that. And I just sort of grabbed this off the web. I'm just sort of setting this up as the sort of thing that we don't want to do. Okay. So, but nevertheless, this is kind of what this was the sort of homework problems that I, did when I was an undergraduate. And, my assertion here is that with modern computational resources, we can go well beyond that objective of just getting numbers. We can teach engagement in scientific methods, examination of relationships, hypothesis generation, model building, critical assessment, and so on. And to do that, it's worth articulating a pedagogical framework that is set up to facilitate those goals, which I kind of want to tell you about next. So we're calling it a computational guided inquiry pedagogical framework. It's more or less inspired by what happens in a typical lab. So I'm kind of showing you how labs work. When a student goes to a lab, there's a lab handout that kind of coordinates everything that they're going to do. Often an instructor makes a claim, then talks about, then maybe the class talks about or possibly revises that claim. I mean, this is all scientific method stuff. Maybe in the lab, students learn about some relevant tool. I put some Erlenmeyer flasks there. They use the tool to gather evidence, make some predictions, and at some point, there's some sort of reconciliation or assessment. And why is this a great learning, framework? Well, the learning is active, it's totally student-centered, it's still mentored, it is scaffolded, it is iterative, and it's both self-assessed and assessed by instructors. So this is what I love about lab. And in the CGI framework, the computational guided inquiry framework, here instead of a lab handout, the center coordinating document is a Jupyter Notebook, which I'll tell you a lot about later. And but all the rest of this is kind of the same. You talk about revised claims. Oh, and instead of, plugging into, some sort of experimental technique, computational tools are involved in this whole picture. So I want to talk a little bit about those computational tools, and then afterward, I'm going to talk about Jupyter Notebooks. The computational tools, we've used all of these. I thought I would just take you through a few of them. Spartan quantum mechanics, that's this sort of thing. It's a commercial product. But for example, in Spartan, you build a molecule and then you say, I would like to know all about its quantum mechanical properties. And so you submit a job. This is what students typically do. And once that's all done, now I can say, well, I know what the orbitals are going to look like. And anyway, you can just do quite a lot about solving Schrodinger's equation, with Spartan. Let's see. PhET simulators are super fun. Oh, I think I'm gonna see if I can get some of those. So here's a PhET simulator that we use in uh, in my courses. So, PhET simulators, they're all built around pedagogy. So, here's one where, what I've just done is or what a student does is try to build atomic nuclei that are stable. This one, beryllium-8, is evidently not stable, and so it undergoes this kind of decay. So this is a really great tool, and it has really it has really just transformed teaching about, Gen Chem. Okay, what else? Let's see. I was hoping that there would be, oh, maybe I can get this one. This is another PhET simulator, which is all about climate change and how climate works. And so I'll come up here, and here you can see, it's a simulator. There's short wave radiance coming from the sun, and it eventually heats up the earth, and there's these long wave photons coming off. There's lots of ways to talk about greenhouse gases. So here's some infrared photons that are hitting this methane molecule, and there's another one hitting some CO2. So yeah. Anyway, so here's a Combio box climate model that we actually wrote. As Dr. Rowe and I put that together, and this is a web accessible one. Here's an emissions scenario for carbon dioxide going to the air since the 1900 and going off into the future. And in this one, I won't play with it, but you can control different parameters like when that emissions peaks is and so forth. And I can tell you what I think the temperature anomaly will be if that were the case. And this is one of my favorite. And Kaitlyn referred to open science and tools that have a really good front end, but they are kind of open-ended in terms of the science. And this is certainly one of these. This is earth.nullschool.net, a tool that I love. It gives you this global perspective. If you want to know about, let's say, let's see if I can find where CO2 sequestration is happening. I can see that the Amazon is doing a great job, and so forth. And if you want to know about where pollutants are happening, then it also allows you to do this. So there are these just really great tools, and so I'm going to go, and then of course there's AI, which won't have that much more to say about it, but there's all these external tools. So how does the CGI framework work for teaching? Well, I can just show you how I used to teach intermolecular bonding. It was pictures like this, cartoons like this, where we talked about charge imbalance, dipole, 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 monopole, and all that sort of stuff. I don't do that anymore. Now I, take advantage of simulations like this. It's worth exploring this here on the left. If you look at it really closely, it's you can tell that these quote molecules are a little bit sticky because they run into each other and then they hang out and then they finally, leave one another. So simulations like this are already kind of, I think, pretty informative. And then here's a claim: molecules are sticky because when they get close to each other, their potential energy is lower. That's a kind of a physical chemist point of view of all this. And so the CGI model that I showed you starts off with that claim. And, we might, talk about or revise that claim. We might learn some relevant tool. And in this case, the tool is in Spartan. I construct a dimer and then I measure its energy in Spartan. Then I construct its monomer. And I look at the difference between that, which tells me, the intermolecular bond strength is on the order of 7 kilojoules per mole. And this part here would be done inside a Jupyter Notebook. And then, of course, there's some sort of comparison with experiment. And in this case, the revision is like, oh, well, that was fun. Let's do it with water and make some predictions about water. And, I'll maybe do the same thing with a couple of argons, and the water you can see produced an energy of 25 kilojoules per mole, which we know is about right for hydrogen bonds. And there's argon. So I'm hoping that the example that I just shared shows that these kinds of learning, are really promoted. Obviously, like in the lab, it's active and it's student-centered. It's iterative because they could do this thing over and again. And it's self-assessed because students themselves would be able to say, oh, I think that my answer looks right, or it looks way far off because of literature values of intermolecular bonds and so forth. So I also like to think that putting Jupyter Notebooks at the center of this, because remember, this used to be in the lab, that would have been a lab handout, that it facilitates also these additional modes and mentoring, scaffolding, and assessment by instructors. And I'm just going to kind of walk us through how that happens. So for one, in a Jupyter Notebook, you get to author what eventually looks like this. Okay, so you get to introduce ideas and present equations, and it's all done in this language called Markdown. It's a lot like LaTeX, if for those of you who are familiar with that. You can bring in images from the outside and so forth. So that's very that's one sort of mechanism by which we deliver, information to students. Another one, number 2 here, is that Jupyter Notebooks let you break up code into these short scaffolded learning sequences. For example, here, this was given as an example code. It's teaching how to do if statements, and then it's a scaffold followed by a your turn kind of thing. So we have scaffolding, that's part of the Jupyter Notebook. And I put this in here because in fact, what students see, it's code like this, but what the instructor generates is essentially the key, that it's the answer key. So in other words, it's really nice in the sense that you never have an answer key that's very different from what students actually see, because you write the answer key first and then you press a button, and then this is what students see. Number 3, Jupyter Notebooks allow you to give students a feedback as fast and as often as you want. I've just shown this to show, a student has submitted electronically an answer to these pause for analysis type questions. There's a scoring rubric here, and then here's a response that I gave to this student. I thought you got some of this fine, but there was other things that I thought could be improved. So there's this electronic feedback. It's this whole ecosystem of submission, feedback, resubmission, and feedback. So this is this assessed by instructors part of that whole thing. Okay. All right. Talked about computational tools. These are computational tools. These are, I think I've kind of gone over. I just want to review that these are all those very cool computational tools, and I didn't even really get to all of them. The reason also that it's great to have a Jupyter Notebook right at the center of this whole thing is that there are tons of computational tools within Python itself. So I'm gonna show you a few of those. In thermodynamics, I make quite a lot of use of these interactive surfaces. They are called thermodynamic surfaces. Students generate them, and then they can examine them like this. So the interactive graphics, especially this plugin called Plotly, is really awesome. We've already seen how you can embed GIFs. You can, there are third-party plugins for solving of ordinary differential equations. I'm kind of hoping that this will come up here in just a sec. But there's lots of different organizations who just submit, packages to be used within Python. I'm not gonna wait for that one. One of them that's I really love is unit management, which we could talk about in the breakout. Unit management does something like this. If I have some calculation that I want to do with Pint as a plugin, you can say things like, I think this quantity alpha is is this value and its units. And therefore, when you calculate quantities from that, it carries through those units and even does unit conversions for you. And this last one is symbolic, like Mathematica, I suppose many of you are familiar with. SymPy is the plugin for Python, and you can do things like that. In this case, my students, I was interested in them deriving critical points for gases, and so what the assignment was essentially, I'm going to teach you how to take derivatives with Python, and then I'm also going to teach you how to solve multiple simultaneous equations. And then finally, we're going to find the critical temperature and volume for a van der Waals gas by doing all that. And here's all the results for that. And so yeah, so there's that. Some parting, and maybe controversial thoughts I thought I would share with you. One of them is that it matters how you deliver all of this stuff to your students. Google Colab provides Jupyter Notebooks. The advantage is that it's free, it's easy to use and access. A deadly, I mean, the reason I don't go for it is that whole plumbing that I was just describing, where students submit work and you return that work electronically, can't do that in Google Colab. The other objection is that if you're not paying for the product, then maybe you are the product. CoCalc is another option there. They have implemented NB Grader, and it's very nice. It's easy to use and access. CoCalc is not free, although it's pretty cheap, and maybe it's better that it's not free because you don't run into that. I don't actually do either of those in my courses. I have my own server with a virtual machine that hosts all of these courses. There's some software called VirtualBox, and now I only have to pay for the hardware, but you have to know or have a friend who knows how to set things up. And I'm just going to say, if you're interested in helping to build a community of practice in the use of Jupyter Notebooks in the context of computational guided inquiry, just please let me know, because I'm very interested in building that community of practice. Let's see, I've got number 2, should we or should we not use unit managers like Pint? Here's just another example of what I was saying before. Here's a number. I have attached a number and its units. Here's another quantity. Here I'm trying to actually get the binding energy of these two CO2 molecules. So I take twice the energy of the monomer, subtract the energy of the dimer. If you do all this, you get a result in Hartrees, but we don't really in chemistry think in Hartrees so much. We like to think in kilojoules per mole. And so here's the critical point, is that I used Python. I used Pint to do that tricky conversion. And so should we do that? Is it cheating? That's another question. I also want to say that the open-endedness of CGIs in this ecosystem, really they mean more time for old-fashioned collaborative mentored Blackboard work. And so and that's pretty important to me. And I'm just sharing this comment. When I asked one of these guys if I could share the photo, the response I got back was this: I didn't prompt for this. They said, it's perfect because we look so joyful in front of all the math, which is not a question statement you usually expect out of a thermodynamics course. Fourth here is, are there deeper connections here that we could learn from? And I was really hesitant to present this idea to you, but I'll tell you why in the end, I thought it was okay. This framework, it's this loop. It kind of looks like actual feedbacks in the climate system, which really makes me wonder, um, is that crazy? Is this a crazy thought that what goes on in a student's mind is similar to what goes on the planet? And as it turns out, I mean, that's actually an old idea or similar to the Gaia hypothesis. And so I just wonder now, should we be thinking about positive and negative learning feedback loops? Because those do happen in the climate system. And I am done. Thank you so much for listening. I had a really fun time preparing for this talk, and I really look forward to your comments in the breakout session if you go to that.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Stephen. And with that, last but not least, I'm thrilled to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Tessa Andrews, Josiah Megg's Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Georgia. So, Tessa, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon or late morning, I guess, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm excited to tell you today about some work I have done with a wonderful team, thinking about the teaching knowledge that we use in our classroom and how that might develop over time. So before I dive into that, I just want to make clear that the work I'm presenting today involves a large team. Postdocs and grad students have worked on this project, as well as a wonderful group of undergraduate researchers. And this work has been funded by generous support from the National Science Foundation. So when we think about teaching and improving teaching, we often think about the classroom practices, what's happening in the classroom. And of course, that's essential for the outcomes that our students are able to achieve as a result of the chance to be in those classrooms. And we try to think about that and then back one step up from that and think about the knowledge that teachers have that inform the practices they use in the classroom. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence from both K-12 instructors as well as higher ed instructors that the knowledge we have about teaching and about our students does inform in important ways the practices we choose to use and the way that we implement those practices in the classroom. And so we as a group are very curious in understanding more about what this knowledge looks like. And so I'm going to ask you to think about that for a second. I'm going to give you a minute to recall a professor you've had who had very impressive disciplinary expertise, but was not successful in helping you learn. And I'm actually not going to give you a minute because you don't need a minute because everyone has had a professor like this. And so that raises interesting questions about what expertise one does need. The system of higher ed is essentially based on the assumption that content knowledge is all you need to be an effective teacher. And yet every one of us has had life experiences that prove that isn't true. And so what is the other expertise someone needs? And answering that question is important so that we can equip faculty with the expertise they need. And so we're interested in this larger question. And I'm going to introduce today kind of three domains of teaching knowledge. Of course, disciplinary knowledge is essential to effective teaching. That's both our knowledge of our content as well as how knowledge is built in our disciplinary areas. I'm not going to focus on that today. I'm going to focus on two other areas of teaching knowledge. One of those I'm going to call pedagogical knowledge. This is knowledge about teaching and learning and how those things work. It is not specific to any particular content. So the pedagogical knowledge I have is going to be useful to me whether I'm teaching topics in genetics or evolutionary biology or plant biology. The other domain of knowledge I'm going to talk about today is called pedagogical content knowledge, and this is knowledge that's specific to topics. So it's about the teaching and learning of specific topics. So I teach a lot of evolutionary biology. I obviously have my own disciplinary knowledge about evolution. My pedagogical content knowledge is expertise on top of that helps me know what are the sorts of ideas my students are likely to have about a topic, what's going to be especially challenging about a topic as I engage them in different sort of activities, how might their thinking change, what kinds of cases or examples are going to be especially helpful to them as they learn a topic. And this knowledge can be very vast because the pedagogical content knowledge I have about teaching about speciation, for example, is going to be largely distinct from the pedagogical content knowledge I have about teaching natural selection or another topic in evolutionary biology. So we are interested especially in these bodies of knowledge and the expertise faculty bring to their teaching in the context of active learning classrooms. And we're defining that very broadly here. We're interested in this because the active learning classroom creates this sort of unique opportunity and test of our pedagogical knowledge and our pedagogical content knowledge. Whereas if I'm presenting a lecture, I can kind of prepare everything ahead of time and go in and deliver it. In an active learning classroom, I have to be ready to respond to things that happen that I might not anticipate. And so my knowledge about how people learn is going to help me do that. And my pedagogical content knowledge about what my students know about particular ideas, that's going to help me anticipate what they might say, make sense of what they might say in real time. So we study faculty in this context, and we asked in the study I'm going to share with you today, what teaching knowledge are instructors using and how do we see that changing as they gain experience? And so we studied faculty who were very early in their teaching career. Usually we started studying them in their very first semester or first year as a college faculty member. And we have 11 faculty that we studied for different lengths of time, but in total we studied them for 40 semesters. And they all taught active learning classes with 50 or more students, so kind of on the medium to large size of classes. And we gathered data from them. We were really interested in the knowledge folks are really applying to their teaching, not their kind of general ideas, but what are they actually using in the day-to-day work of teaching? And so we interviewed people first as they were planning a lesson. And as you may know, as college faculty, often we are doing our planning at the last moment. So we usually interviewed them the day before they taught a lesson. To ask about what the plan was, why that was the plan, what did they expect, what kind of ideas did they expect from students, kind of everything that they were thinking about in preparing a lesson. Then we filmed the lesson. And then we did a second interview right afterwards, usually 24 to 48 hours later, and we showed them videos of their own classroom. And we asked things like, tell me everything you can remember thinking in this moment. And when you get the chance to see and hear yourself, even if you feel uncomfortable about it, you do remember pretty well what it is that was going through your mind at that time. So we got insights into the knowledge they were using in the moment while they were teaching, and then also some of their reflections after the fact. What knowledge are they using to kind of make sense of what happened in that class period? So this kind of in-depth data collection gave us a lot of insight into the knowledge folks were applying to their teaching. And we recorded them in the same lesson each semester that they taught it. So sometimes that was every semester, sometimes it was once a year, depending on their teaching schedule. And then I'm not going to go into much detail about analysis, but I'd be happy to talk with you about that in the breakout room if you're interested. We used qualitative content analysis of the interviews, and then we also analyzed their teaching practices using some systematic approaches. And we learned a lot. I can only share a small amount of that with you here today, so I just chose a few of the things I thought you might find most useful. So first of all, we found that active learning instructors are relying on quite a wide range of pedagogical knowledge about how people learn. And by that, I mean that folks had pretty different ideas about how people learn, and they often were relying on multiple ideas about how people learn. And so I'm just going to give you a couple examples of that. So one of the ideas that came up quite commonly, we named active rather than passive. And this was the idea that learning occurs when students have the opportunity to engage actively in tasks in the classroom rather than passively listening. And I'll show you an example of that. So Eric, these are all pseudonyms, said, I think I've talked for about 5 or 10 minutes here, and this question is just to get them engaged, right? To break up the time of me talking and droning on. So that's a pretty classic example from our data set of this particular idea. Now, here's another idea folks had about how people learn. We called this one to explain is to learn. And this is the idea that learning really occurs when students outwardly express their thinking, often verbally, but also perhaps in some sort of written explanation or diagram. And here's an example of that from Kim. She said, students can take on a teaching role, and that can help their learning. I think the best way you learn something is by explaining it to someone else. So these are two perhaps quite different ideas about how people learn in an active learning classroom, and I want to invite you to think about them. So how might an instructor who thinks about active learning as breaking up a lecture choose to implement something like a think, pair, share differently than an instructor who thinks about active learning as creating opportunities for students to explain their reasoning? So I'm going to invite you to think about this for a minute or two, and then let's use the chat to share ideas. Some of the different ideas I see coming up are the nature of the questions that are asked might be different. I'm also seeing some differences in how they would be implemented. So whether students are given time, for example, to talk to each other, and perhaps even how they're instructed, the directions or guidance they're given about what they're meant to do when they're talking to each other. So feel free to keep adding if you have more ideas, but I will keep moving forward. I think that it seems that those who contributed to the chat are recognizing that a difference in ideas about how people learn might have some real ramifications for what people choose to do in the classroom and how they choose to implement that. And one idea I want to point out that I think is coming through in some of what you're offering in the chat is that this first idea, active rather than passive, the underlying assumption of this idea is still that students learn well from lectures, but that they need breaks. So in this idea, we're thinking that lectures where the learning happens, and to maximize that learning, we need to give them breaks so they can continue to pay attention to our lectures. In contrast, the other idea is really thinking that it's actually the explaining, the students talking to one another is where the learning happens. And those are very different ideas about how learning happens that are likely to result in pretty different ways of spending time in class and designing lessons. I want to offer just one more example of the kinds of ideas about how people learn. I don't get to share them all today, but this one I really appreciated and might resonate with you. We called this one refraining from explaining. And here instructors expressed how they really work to keep the onus on students for thinking by prompting students to explain and trying to refrain from offering explanations themselves. And this is often something that they talked about as they were like facilitating students working in small groups. So an example of this, Amy said, she's looking at a video of herself and she's telling us how she was thinking about it. She says, I'm trying to identify how far through this thought process they're able to navigate on their own, and then see how little I can give them to go the rest of the way. If they just need a tiny little push or a tiny little point in a direction, that's making them use a lot more brain power and a lot more of the skills we're trying to build than if I told them they were wrong and then told them the right answer. And something that stood out to us in this data is folks often struggled to enact this idea, even if they expressed it in interviews as a goal in a way they thought about student learning, that it was hard. They really had to restrain themselves and be pretty intentional because they liked explaining things and students wanted them to explain things. And so that, I think, is an idea that pairs well with to explain is to learn and how you might help enact that or work to enact that in your own classroom. So I'm going to give just one example. This was a longitudinal study, and I think in papers we can do a good job conveying that. It's a little bit harder in a short talk. So I'm just going to give one example from an instructor called Irene of her knowledge and her practices. So in the first semester that we interviewed her, she displayed a range of knowledge, but I'm going to highlight one piece here. She said, being an active participant in the process and applying is just a much better way of learning. They're applying their knowledge, and sometimes the questions are simple in terms of they just have to regurgitate, but most of the time I'm trying to get them to apply. So she's talking to us about what it is her goals are for these questions she's having students do in class. And in the lesson this semester, she posed clicker questions, and students answered those without any discussion. And the clicker questions that she asked were all multiple choice. And then in the next semester that we interviewed her, she said something a little bit different. She said, if you just poll them once, they're not having to explicitly explain why. You could just pick an answer. But talking to somebody, you actually have to say why. By that, you're having to engage with the material more to have that conversation, I think. And that can lead to a deeper understanding of it and just realizing that maybe, oh, my initial impression was wrong. It gives them time to reevaluate. And in this semester, she did things a little bit differently. So she's still posing quicker questions, but she was encouraging students to talk in small groups about those questions. And then she asked the same question again after students had talked in small groups. And her clicker questions were open-ended rather than being multiple choice questions. And when we asked her about some of these changes, she said, this is new for me this year. This was actually suggested to me by our center, Focus on Teaching and Learning. And I really like this suggestion because it allows the students to think about their answer. So we see some shifts in her thinking as well as some shifts in her practices, and we get a little clue that some engagement in teaching professional development contributed to these shifts that we saw. So one of the questions that I'm really curious about is how is this pedagogical knowledge developed? And we were able to characterize how people's knowledge changed over time, but we weren't systematically trying to understand what was causing that change. But nonetheless, we get some clues from our data. So the first point that is resoundingly clear from the data is that teaching experience alone is insufficient. We, watched people change over time or not change. And in terms of this type of knowledge, we saw a lot of not changing over time. There are examples in our data set of people talking about teaching professional development experiences that really informed the choices that they have, the knowledge that they have about how students learn. And so this is Irene again. And she says, I suppose the one thing that I always took away from this particular worksheet was that you can, even if you've got a big class and multiple choice questions, you can ask those higher learning things. You don't have to just ask basic recall questions. And then another source of learning that I didn't anticipate and found really interesting is that faculty were reflecting on their own learning, both as students and as teachers, and then trying to create those opportunities for their students. So this participant said, I think when I was a student, I learned the most by not only being able to figure it out myself, but also being able to teach it to other people. So for the students who do understand it and are getting it, no problem. They can then teach it to their neighbor and reinforce that. Or as they teach it, they realize, oh, I have a misconception here, or I have a lack of understanding in this section. And so this person's reflecting on how even as a student, they benefited by teaching things to other people. And so that's part of their rationale for engaging their students in small group discussion that they see as beneficial both to students who might feel they already know and those who may not. How am I doing on time, Drew?
About another minute or so.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna wrap up here then and just go to a final slide. I'm not gonna have time to tell you today about pedagogical content knowledge, but I do want to share some resources if you want to learn a little bit more. So this QR code will take you to a Google Doc. It includes links to research papers, including one about the pedagogical content knowledge development. That work is already published. The work I was able to share with you today is not yet published, but hopefully will be soon. And it also has some ideas for reflection and actions to build your own teaching knowledge. And we wrote those recommendations based on what we saw working for our participants. And there's some acknowledgements over here, and then also a link to our lab website, which has all our publications information. And I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tessa. And with that, with our 3 wonderful presentations done, we're now going to transition to our breakout rooms for Q&A and further discussion. Breakout rooms are self-assigned and organized by speakers, so I will launch those now, and you will see each speaker's name listed. So whichever room you'd like to join and have deeper engagement, you'll be able to select from there. Then go ahead and open the rooms. You should see a pop-up on your screen allowing you to select a breakout room. If you do not see that pop-up, you can navigate to the bottom of your screen and select the breakout rooms button, and click the room you'd like to enter. And if you're running an older version of Zoom or don't see the breakout room button, you can post in the chat which room you'd like to enter, and we will assign you on our end. We'll give some time for discussion, see how flow's going. I'll probably call people back to around like 3:20, 3:25 Eastern time. And I hope folks have a productive discussion, and we'll be back here soon. Looks like we got everyone here. I hope folks had some good conversations, good connections. I know we're reaching the end of the time. It's a lot of screen time. I know that for myself. So I think if we just do some quick readouts or any thoughts from our speakers, whether from the breakout rooms or just hearing other people's works and connections, even your own experience talking about your work. Curious to see what reflections and thoughts we have. So Kaitlyn, if we don't mind starting with you.
Yeah, in the breakout, I did a quick demo of some of the open science resources that I talked about in the presentation, but also the Allen Institute has a lot more open resources than those, and then there's a whole universe of open resources beyond what the Allen Institute offers. The principles that we talked about in my presentation would apply to any open science resource. So if you have technical challenges getting started, that is one of the barriers. Don't hesitate to get in touch. And we're happy to help. And also, we still need faculty to respond to an additional survey and pass it on to their students. So please use the link that I put in the chat earlier. We are recruiting.
Awesome. Awesome. Stephen, how about you? Any highlights or standout thoughts?
Oh, I just want to say I found the other two speakers really fascinating. Thank you for all of that. And also it's really fascinating to see how there's an overlap between how we're thinking about pedagogy going forward and using computing. That I just thought, I've never met Tessa or Kaitlyn before, but there was obviously a lot of overlap there.
Beautiful. Thank you. And with that, Tessa, anything from you?
We just had some good discussion about the different sort of circumstances people face in their classrooms and what does that mean for how we engage students who may have different backgrounds, different amounts of time to invest in things, sometimes facing really large classes, and how do these things translate or apply? And so it's great to hear people's questions and get some ideas.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing not only those readouts, but also your presentations, all your wonderful work, and appreciate everyone here who attended and stayed not only for the presentations, but for the breakout rooms to make some connections, conversations. Yeah, it's been a really fantastic session. I have a few more not housekeeping, house closing, however you want to phrase it, comments. So I'm gonna pull up some slides here and get everyone going on their day. And as that comes up, I just want to thank all of our speakers and facilitators, the rest of the AAAS IUSE team, and all of you who are able to join and participate in the workshop once again today. We have a survey link, which my colleague Thomas is posting in the chat. We'll also be sending it via email. The survey should only take a few minutes, but we'd really appreciate your feedback. And as mentioned, a recording of the presentation will be posted on our website and emailed to you in the coming days. I cannot say it enough. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And really, we would appreciate any type of thoughts or comments or suggestions or anything on our workshop series. We will be launching a call for workshop proposals later this fall, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. We hope some of you will consider presenting your work for our workshop series in 2026 and that you'll all join us for the series in the new year. Wild to think we're already talking about the new year. I feel like October just started 4 seconds ago, but until next time, and as always, we look forward to engaging with you and learning from you, our incredible AAAS IUSE community. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the year.